My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 34-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas, Texas. And I'd like to welcome you all to our Zoom discussion today with our friend Brian Wesbury, entitled The Most Dangerous Experiment in World History. And today, at least, you cannot fault us for having a boring title, because this is a pretty good title. We really do appreciate you all being here with us. We especially thank, as a nonprofit organization that is dependent on our donors and our supporters, we especially thank those of you who are financial supporters of our work, those of you who took the opportunity to make an additional donation when you signed up for this event. We very much appreciate it. And if after this discussion you decide that we're an organization worth supporting, you're welcome to contact Addie Crimmins at IPI, and she would be more than happy to tell you about our new Giving Society, which is essentially our membership system, or to help you determine how you would like to be involved with IPI. Let's get on to our program. Remember back when people used to care about balanced budgets, budget deficits, and national debt? That seems almost quaint today. We here at the Institute for Policy Innovation have never been deficit hawks. We have always cared most about economic growth. We've never really been fans of a balanced budget amendment and things like that. We've always leaned more towards spending limitation than balanced budget requirements because we don't like anything that forces automatic tax increases. What we care about is economic growth and economic liberty. And as long as the government's able to maintain and service a reasonable level of debt that's not a burden, we've never really had a big problem with that. After all, families use debt as a tool to buy homes and to finance education and cars. A serviceable level of debt is actually a useful tool, not only for a family, but for a government. But that whole discussion seems antiquated at this point. No one seems to care anymore about fiscal prudence of any kind, to any degree. No one wants to talk about balancing the budget, reducing deficits. Even discussions about getting our entitlements under control now seem to be off the table. And at this point, may be impossible given the amount of debt that we have built up in this country. The American experiment with economic liberty and individual liberty has made the United States the most successful nation in world history. But those who disagree with those policies have in mind a great reset that would limit economic liberty, dramatically expand government and government control over the economy. And they're using COVID-19 as pandemic as a cover. These big government progressives think that they can do anything. And Joe Biden's campaign slogan of Build Back Better is only a hint of things to come. You've heard Democrats talking about how when COVID is over, going back to the way things were is not acceptable. So they're using the COVID-19 pandemic as cover to try to move through an entire Christmas tree of progressive economic policies, including modern monetary theory and paying people not to work. The result is likely to be economic chaos, higher interest rates, and higher unemployment. So we're really delighted today, because we think these are really crucial public policy issues. We're delighted to have noted economist Brian Wesbury with us today to talk us through this dangerous path that we are on. And I will warn you, you might need a stiff drink to get through today's Zoom. Brian is a chief economist at First Trust Advisors. He has been a member of the Academic Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He's been a fellow at the George W. Bush Center here in Dallas. He's been a chief economist for the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress. And, you know, if I may just say so informally, Brian, you've always been a part of sort of the economic growth wing of the conservative movement and the free market policy. And that's always where we've been as well. The Wall Street Journal once named Brian as the #1 economic forecaster in the US. He writes all over the place. His pieces show up in national publications on a regular basis. He maintains an economic policy blog. And Brian's focus is on macroeconomic trends and economic forecasting. But as I've suggested, the most important thing is that Brian thinks like we think here at IPI. And so we're really delighted that he could join us here today. So Brian, at that point, I will stop talking and I will turn things over to you.
Hey, Tom, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I can't wait. I don't even call it Q&A. I call it conversation at the end. So I can't wait for the conversation with the people who are with us today at the end. And so I'm going to try. Boy, there are so many things to talk about. I'm going to try to keep this pretty succinct, hit what I think are the major topics, and then hopefully we can dig into things deeper with your input, others' input in a few minutes. So,
Right.
So first of all, just from a forecasting point of view, because my real job, my day job is forecasting. I work for a money management firm. And what I am telling people these days, and I'll stop doing that in just a second, is that this is both the easiest time I've ever had to forecast and the hardest. And what I mean by the easiest is when the Federal Reserve is jamming trillions of dollars into the system, when the federal government borrows $5 trillion over 15 months and starts handing it out, when we have shut down the economy, now are reopening it. So you have reopening, a flood of new money, a flood of borrowing and spending. That's easy. Everything's going to explode right now. And this is one of the things that I warn people about, is that this is not a normal recovery. You cannot go back to 1982 and go, hey, we created, X million jobs in a certain number of months, and that's what we're doing now. Or 08, it took us longer to recover. This is an artificial recovery. It's going to drive stocks up. It has already. It's going to continue to do that for the near term. It's 12, 18, maybe 24 months from now that I get really nervous. And Tom, you said it really well. America is the most successful experiment in economic history and governance, the history of governance of man, and I believe we are now embarking on the most dangerous experiment, because we're messing with the very things that created the wealth that we have become so used to. One of my favorite books of recent years is Why We Bite the Invisible Hand. And the invisible hand is what allowed us to create a vaccine in 10 months, whether you believe in it or not. It's still miraculous science. That's what, and yet we're going to do things that undermine our ability to do that in the future. I've been saying this since last March and April. Shutting down the economy was a huge mistake. I think it will go down in the annals of history as one of the biggest policy mistakes ever in U.S. history. And let's tease a little bit out of that. But before we go there, I think the damage done to our economy from the shutdown, it's more than mental health, it's more than problems with future spending, but a market system. You can't really call the U.S. a free market, but a market system depends on the free flow of information. One of my favorite essays, I'm sure everybody on the call today has read I, Pencil by Leonard Reed. I bring it up everywhere I can. And by the way, if you don't use it to teach your 5th grade class or your 11th grade, class, when they ask you to come in and share what you do, I think you're missing an opportunity to share that. But the point is, no one knows how to make a pencil. And now what we're finding out is no one knows how to make a semiconductor. No one knows how to make lumber. And when you destroy, I'm just short-circuiting this, when you destroy the information by shutting down the economy, we create long-term damage. This is not 3 months. All of a sudden we're going to start producing semiconductors again, and everything is going to be fine. We have damaged the inner workings of the market system, and that really does worry me in the future. That does two things. It slows our growth down, which you and I, Tom, that's what we care about the most, but it also drives inflation up. And by the way, higher inflation goes, the worse growth becomes. So having said that, we're looking at an economy today where debt is over 100% of GDP, where the government has expanded its activities. $5 trillion of deficit spending in the last 15 months. And the real question is, when does that damage show up? We have to pay it back. How much damage did it really create? What are the problems that we face? And so part of what I have done is go back in history. I think that's I mean, we have to look at history. How have we dealt with other periods of time that might be similar? And I hear people saying Joe Biden is like LBJ or Joe Biden is like FDR. So this is the 30s or this is the 60s and 70s. And I don't think either of those comparisons right now is the appropriate comparison. I really look at what we have done as more like World War II. And at the end of World War II, we had government debt well over 100% of GDP. And the question is, how did we deal with that? Because we grew rapidly in the 50s and 60s after that. And there's a couple of reasons, in my opinion. Number one, we were the last country standing. I mean, we had firebombed Japan. It was, forget the nuclear weapons. The firebombing was more damaging than those nuclear weapons. Europe was destroyed. The UK had been bombed for 5 years straight. And so the U.S., because we had learned, in a way, if you think about it, our Zoom call, our use of technology in the past year is just like our enhancements of manufacturing and being able to build Jeeps and planes and bullets and bombs faster than any other country in the world. And that's what and then we took that and moved it into a more normal non-wartime economy. So we grew our way out of that debt, which is exactly what, Tom, you and I argue all the time. The debt's not the problem, it's the growth rate. Well, let's look at today. We're not the last man standing. We have a competitor in China. We have competitors all over the world. We do have a better healthcare system. Without the United States, I don't believe we would have vaccines today. But we have debt over 100% of GDP. So how do we deal with this? And one of the ways that I'm going to give you a negative and a positive here. The negative is, if we go back to the 1940s, I mean, obviously war is hell, but we spent well over 100% of GDP building bombs, bullets, planes to blow things up. And also we sent our young, mostly men, to die, all right? Today, I have a place in Colorado. I'm right on the Colorado River. I was out there last summer, and I have never seen more drift boats, rafts, people on the river every day. Like it was like bumper to bumper traffic on the river. I've never seen anything like it. And I asked the locals what's going on, and they go, well, they call them Stemi Boats. And what that means is that all these people in Colorado were getting stimulus payments, and then they were going and buying a boat. And they called them Stemi Boats. And they didn't have a job. They didn't have to work because the country was shut down. So, and by the way, Colorado, there's a few things legal out there that aren't legal other places. So technically what we did is we borrowed money, and instead of sending young men to die for our freedom, we sent young men to party on the river. What a devastating set of economic consequences. And so we come out of this with really strained supply chains, still paying people not to work, the damage to those supply chains, and a much bigger government than we had before. And as a result, there's really only one way out of this, and that is growth. And right now, and this will be an interesting point of conversation, because right now, it seems like the progressive platform is kind of hitting a wall. They went from $2.25 trillion stimulus down to less than $1 trillion. They're trying to figure out how they get through this human infrastructure bill. And tax hikes, which they at first were going to do in April, don't look like they're going to happen until next year. They may be off the table completely. So far, we have a one-time spending deal that will go away. We haven't permanently increased the size of the government yet. I'm still hoping that the Constitution and the makeup of our political system effectively fights that. But then how do we pay that debt back? And this is where, and then I'll come back and circle at the end. Think about the technology, the cloud. We wouldn't have been able to get through this pandemic without the technologies that we have. The cloud is still in its infancy. Blockchain. I'm not a huge fan of crypto. I don't think it's going to take over the dollar, but blockchain is here to stay. It's going to radically alter the way we deal with information over the internet and on the cloud. It's all linked together. Elon Musk, he's an interesting cat. You could say all kinds of things about him, but he is putting up Starlink, which is a network of at least 12,000. He's now asked for, I think, 40,000 satellites to go around the world to bring high-speed internet access to the most rural areas of America or uninhabited areas of the world. All you need is a little dish. Compared to the options that are out there right now, this is a huge game changer. It's 5G is coming on. And so when I look at those technologies, we have an ability to grow that we might not have had 10, 15 years ago. That doesn't mean we're going to boom. We should grow faster than we likely will. And I'll use this analogy or this comparison. When President Obama was in office, we saw tax hikes, regulatory increases, spending increases, Obamacare, all those things. And a lot of conservatives were like, that's it. We're going to go into a recession. We're going to go into depression. We can't grow. And I would argue, look, I don't like any of those things. However, on the other side, technology is so strong that we might be able to grow, to eke out growth anyway. And it turns out we did. I called it the plow horse economy. So we only grew 2%. We need to grow 4%. We should have been growing 4 or 5 or 6. If it weren't for the policies of the Obama administration, we would have grown faster. But it didn't mean we were going to immediately go into a recession. And so as we move into into next year and the year after that, those are the two forces that I'm looking at. I wish I had the perfect answer for you. Technology is going to win no matter what Biden does or the Great Reset people do. It won't matter, but we don't know yet. And so I beg for time just to wait in terms of a forecaster. What we do know is the more they grow the government, the slower we will grow versus what we should have grown. And that's the sad thing. We have also taught a whole generation of people that we can pay them not to work. And one of the biggest problems I think we face today is that no one is educated on economics anymore. No one. If I believe my Twitter feed, we have raised a generation of idiots when it comes to economics. They don't understand inflation. They don't understand interest rates. They don't understand deficits. And then that brings me to my final sort of closing comments here. This is the most dangerous experiment in the history of the world. And I will tell you, Tom, I don't know about your experience or anyone that's with us today, but I'm on Twitter. I love Twitter. I think it's glorious. I hate that they took the president off and all that stuff, but it's really a fun option of way to communicate. But I used to see these comments about the Great Reset, and a lot of them that I saw were really way to the far edge. And I'm like, that's almost sounds like a conspiracy theory. Like you're talking about getting rid of the U.S. dollar, going to the SDR, which is not going to happen in my lifetime. And I would hear, these kinds of, that's what the Great Reset is. They're going to take our currency away. And as a result, I really didn't look at it. Like I kind of put it off to the side. I knew there were people that talked about it, but one day I finally go, all right, I'm going to dig into this. And I went and bought Klaus Schwab's book, who's the founder of the World Economic Forum, and we all know of it as Davos. That's where Bill Gates and the finance minister of China go and they meet and they talk about how they're going to change the world. He wrote a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset. And it's all in there, in print. I mean, exactly what they want to do. Because if you listen to Joe Biden, Build Back Better, Boris Johnson repeated this the other day, AOC, and what they do is they conflate in the book, COVID comes from global warming. And not only that, COVID affects people of lower equality more than people of higher incomes, and which then causes more global warming, and which then means we need more national health care, which then means we need more modern monetary theory, and it just goes, it's this circle of a narrative, of an argument to grow and grow and grow the government. But when you really dig down, when I think about it, this is no different in a sense, an argument than we've dealt with for the last, well, hundreds, thousands of years, really. And that is the battle between the creation of wealth and the redistribution of wealth. Who controls the distribution of wealth, assets, resources in the economy? And we all know, I think on this call, that it's the market that does the best job, because no one knows how to make a pencil. No one. All right. People know how to make yellow paint. They know how to make, get the wood out of the forest, but they don't know how to make a pencil without all the other millions of people that are involved. And the only way to organize that is through the market system. And so that brings me back to where we started. Right now, it almost doesn't matter. We can close our eyes and we're going to grow. And that is because we're flooding the system with new money. It's after that when we're going to pay a price. Now, one thing that I think people have to realize is that every country in the world is doing this. So this, just because we're doing it doesn't mean the dollar is going to collapse, because I think all currencies are going to go down together. They'll buy fewer assets. And so we need to prepare for inflation. We need to prepare eventually for higher interest rates. This experiment will not work. I think Mervyn King said it best. Modern monetary theory. There's nothing modern about it. There's nothing monetary about it, and there's no theory behind it. It's a made up thing. And so the last point I will make is that I'm telling people right now as an advisor to be long, to own your home, to borrow 30-year mortgages, and all of that's going to be a way to defend yourself against this. It's kind of like the 70s in terms of the economic environment. But here's the issue, and we have a battle because right now people feel good, but they don't understand that the reason they feel good is because it's fake. And the analogy I use there is pretty simple. You're in a car accident, and they give you morphine, and your leg is really broken up, but you don't feel it at all. And that's what this morphine right now is. It's all this easy money. It's all this borrowing from our children and grandchildren, and it makes people feel like you can get away with this. I see hosts on TV talk about this and go, well, the economy, we created 800,000 jobs. All this spending must work. And I'm like, well, it works like morphine, right?
Yeah.
Once it wears off, the pain is there.
Or like a sugar high for a small child or something, right?
Exactly the same thing, or a Red Bull for,
Right.
Yeah,
but the crash comes later.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I'm not looking for a Great Depression out there right now. And one of the things that you pointed out made me think about it is that in the U.S. today, one thing to remember is that we have $200 trillion of private net worth. That would be businesses, all our homes, all our vehicles, the things that we own. And right now, I think there's 24 trillion in government debt. So if you kind of do that on a balance sheet, we're not Puerto Rico yet. We're not Greece yet, but we are headed that way. And the scary things to me are that they want trillions more in spending, but this time for permanent increase in government. They want to raise tax rates to slow things down. We're not there yet. It seems like they're having a harder and harder time getting it done, probably because a lot of what you've done to push back and fight and stiffen the spines of politicians out there, which we have to keep doing. But I think one of the big problems is people think all this spending worked. You can just shut down an economy and keep growing, but it's fake. This is a true sugar high. Finally, let me just I'll hit a little detail. This is kind of a inside monetary baseball kind of thing. People say, well, wait a minute. After 2008, 2009, we did quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve increased their balance sheet by trillions of dollars, but it didn't cause inflation. So why would it this time? And I think the answer is pretty simple. So in 08, 09, yes, the Fed boosted its balance sheet dramatically, but with the other hand, they hammered banks with new regulation. So that money was put into the monetary system, but with all that regulation, they limited the amount that got into the economy. So M2, which is what Milton Friedman told me to watch, grew about 6% a year from 2009 up to 2020. This time, the Fed did quantitative easing again, but now we paid banks to make loans. We also direct deposited a lot of that cash into bank accounts. And as a result, M2 is now up 32% above where it was in February 2020. You cannot add 32% more money supply without getting inflation. And so that it's a law of physics, it's like gravity. It's Milton Friedman. And the saddest event of this past year that I saw was when Jerome Powell was in front of Congress. I think it was Senator Kennedy that was asking him about, well, what about the money supply? And Jerome Powell said, I think, back in the day when we went to school, us old guys, is kind of what he was saying, we learned that the money supply and inflation went together. He goes, nowadays, we just have to unlearn that. That was his direct phrase. And basically, I take that as unlearning Milton Friedman. And that is a disaster. And so this modern monetary theory, this idea that you can just print all the money you want and the economy will just grow to absorb it, it doesn't work. It can't, if it was already going to happen, you don't need more money to make it happen. And so this idea that somehow printing money creates wealth is wrong. It's always been wrong. And that's one of the most dangerous things I see right now, because it acts like morphine, hides people from the pain while the government grows underneath. And so we just have to keep fighting. So far, I think, $5 trillion in spending is not a win. Do not hear me say that. But the fact that we were able to kind of slow the progressive movement down quite a bit in the last 6 months, I think is a real positive, but more work needs to be done. So thank you, Tom. I could ramble on, but maybe I will if we get some comments.
Well, we have lots of comments, and I've got enough things I want to talk to you about that would fill this whole event, but I promised Dr. Matthews I would let him go first. But I want to mention one thing, since you mentioned the iPencil essay and how crucial understanding that really is. We here at IPI have a podcast called IPI Policy Basics, and we try to explain just basic policy concepts from a free market, limited government standpoint. And we did a specific podcast on the iPencil essay and what it means and how those lessons apply to the economy and how you think about the economy. So I would encourage folks who are listening today, go to the iTunes store or whatever podcast platform you listen to, look for IPI Policy Basics and find that episode, because that's a really fundamental basic thing to understand if you want to understand why a free market bottom-up economy works better than a top-down government-directed economy. Okay, so I'll stop there, although I've got lots more, and I'll let Dr. Matthews engage with you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Brian. So you'd mentioned taxes once, I think, in there. I think we at IPI believe that one of Trump's greatest accomplishments was the tax reform bill of December 2017. Especially the corporate income tax, lowering it from 35% down to 21%.
Right.
Joe Biden wants to change that. He had wanted to raise it back up to 35. I think he's now saying 28%. But we would argue that lowering that corporate tax rate has encouraged companies to reshore, build more here, manufacturing and stuff. It takes a little while, but that was one of the impetus. Whereas Democrats had kept saying, we don't know why these companies are moving overseas. And remember the Barack Obama tried to do what he called a patriot tax or something, where he said we're gonna impose a tax on these companies if they offshore. So we think that was a good one. I like your comments on that. And number two, Janet Yellen and President Biden are proposing a global tax. They've made some progress in getting a lot of countries to sign on. They've still got a long ways to go to actually get it implemented through these various legislatures, both here and abroad. But what are your thoughts on the global tax?
Yeah, that's the worst idea ever. What I love is, he came out with let's have collusion with other countries and get a minimum tax that we all agree to. But at the same time, I'm going to push more competition among private companies. Like, wait a minute, if you're for competition, you ought to be for tax competition. But Beryl, you brought up I think an interesting point. I'm going to go a little different direction, but come back to the tax. If we go back to the 1980s, so I'm old enough to remember the 70s and early 80s, and one of the things that Ronald Reagan, I mean, not only did Ronald Reagan obviously love America, bled red, white, and blue as a true patriot from I'm an Eagle Scout, so that that guy, like, just, he will live in my brain till the day I die. But he also cared about the world. And he really, truly believed that the magic of America, the magic of freedom, the magic of capitalism could lift people all over the world out of poverty. And I kind of go back to the early 80s. I know India was a big impoverished country, but China was a big impoverished country, 1 billion people, impoverished. And what we said was, here's the way I interpret history, is that we said, okay, let's help China grow. And one of the ways we're going to help them is to let them produce and export. We're going to open up trade channels. And it worked. China grew, started lifting living standards. And at some point in there, we should have said, okay, you're grown up, get a job, get a haircut, all right, raise your tariffs to normal levels of the world, where you're no longer most favored nation. You have to compete on a level playing field. And this is what Donald Trump kept telling us. But we let it go. It probably went on. I don't know whether it's 15 years or 18 years too long, but at some point in there, we should have normalized trade relations, brought China in as a normal, instead of giving them all these easy outs and benefits that reduced tariffs, et cetera. And we didn't. And so Donald Trump did two things. Number one, said, wait a minute, 15 years ago, we should have done this. Well, I'm going to do it today. All right, we're gonna tell them to grow up and compete on a level playing field, but we're also going to stop taxing our companies at 35%, which gives that. So China had a double benefit. Not only didn't they have corporate tax rates like ours, but they also had most favored nation status. And so Trump changed both of those. And my view is that Meryl, you said it takes time. We were beginning to see the benefits of those policies. And by the way, this went against everything we had done for the previous 20 years. Yeah. And that's why they fought it so hard. And so right now, you mentioned, Joe Biden wants 35%. He was forced to kind of cut it back to 28 for the corporate tax. And then even Joe Manchin said, I can't sign on to 28. And that's sort of what I mean by the progressive agenda kind of in decline. We may end up with 25. We may. I still think there's a chance we get through all of this without tax hikes, but I don't want to bet on that. We have to keep pushing. But you are absolutely right. Raising those corporate tax rates is bad for America, and that's why this minimum tax on a global basis is Ireland will never sign on. All right, and at some point there's going to be countries that won't sign on, and they'll just win. My example is, what if Ford told GM, you have to share all your technology with us because it's unfair. You have better technology than us. You can make a lower price car. You have to raise the price of your car because this isn't fair competition. Well, I think governments ought to compete just like athletes, politicians, and companies. Everybody, competition makes us better. And so getting rid of competition in the globe That's what they want to do by getting a minimum tax rate. This should be fought every step of the way. It is not a good thing.
I'll ask one more question, then I'll turn it back to Tom. And I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. When the unemployment rate came out a week or two ago down to 5.9%, I saw statements from the White House, statements in the media saying, this is really good, but it's going to take us a couple more years before we get back to pre-pandemic unemployment levels. And I wrote something saying, I doubt we ever get back to pre-pandemic unemployment levels if Joe Biden is successful in getting his tax and spending legislation through. But there's a sort of notion that somehow the other 3.5% unemployment, which we had in January and February of 2020 before the pandemic, and the lowest rates for Hispanics and Blacks we had ever seen. It had been 50 years since we were down at 3.5% for the economy as a whole. Somehow they think that's the norm, and it's just going to take all this spending to get us back there to it when it goes just the opposite direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Merrill, I 1000% agree with your statement. As the way policies are right now, we're not going to get back to February of 2020 levels, not of economic growth, at least in the longer term, or of unemployment and jobs. And I think one of the best signs of how damaging all of this has been is that today we have roughly 7 million fewer people employed than we did in February 2020. 7 million. And by the way, the economy's wide open. It shouldn't be there. But at the same time, you know what retail sales are? They're 18% above where they were in February 2020. So think about that. Retail sales up 18%, jobs down 7 million. How is that possible? Well, there's only one way. We're borrowing from our kids to spend today. You were using the credit card to spend, and we don't have a job. This is why I say it's like paying people to party, and whereas in the 40s we sent people to die. This is an awful set of economic policies. I worry about the long-term consequences psychologically to people for paying them not to work. Forget the economic lessons people think they're learning. This is damaging individuals, and as a result, that's a whole nother reason I think you're absolutely right that we're not going to get back to those as long as these policies are in place. Markets work. And the government is the most anti-competitive institution in the world. Government does not want competition. Never does. I mean, heck, if you look at, politicians, they don't want to face an electorate every year. Why they try to make the electoral laws, they gerrymander, they do all kinds of things to protect them from competition. Schools. Public schools, they fight charter schools, homeschoolers, private schools. They don't want vouchers. They don't want competition. And that's why when Joe Biden came out the other day and said, I'm going to pass 72 new laws, I guess, or regulations using a dozen different agencies to create more competition, well, that'd be great. If it really was more competition, we would grow faster. But that's not what they want. They want to control things more. And that really scares me about the future and makes you exactly right, that if this keeps up, we won't get back to where we were under President Trump in February 2020.
All righty, here we go. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
All right.
Brian, COVID-19 did not affect everybody equally. It didn't affect everybody the same. In fact, I don't want to sound like a lefty, but it really harmed low-income people more than it harmed high-income people. There are many of us with white-collar professional jobs who were able to just pretty much continue on the way that we did. Right. Whereas people who work in service industry jobs, restaurants and bars and things like that were prohibited from working. But yet the government relief programs applied equally to everybody. There were businesses that were devastated, but there were also businesses that probably did better during COVID-19.
Right.
But they could get PPP money too, and they could get subsidized SBA loans too. So it's an interesting example of how that's the problem with these top-down, one-size-fits-all solutions, is that they're not granular, they're not targeted. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal early on in the pandemic, arguing that what we ought to do is just offer government guaranteed lines of credit, to businesses and things like that they would have to pay back. And so you would gauge your own level of need, and you would gauge your own level of damage and how much debt you could service or whatever. But that's not what we did. And so there was this very interesting article that came out, I think it was late last summer, about how, what do you know, the household savings rate has gone up.
Right.
I mean, we've been complaining for decades about the fact that Americans don't save enough, and all of a sudden the savings rate went up. Well, it was because of all this cash that was being helicoptered on top of everybody, right?
Yep.
It's like the thing you described, people going out and buying boats and things like that. It's, we showered all this money on people, and it's very hard to take something back once the government has extended it. There's an article today in the Wall Street Journal about all of these households with children now who are getting checks from the government.
Right.
It's like several $100s per child every month. Right. How do you ever take that back? How do you ever wean people off of that? I mean, so I guess these are examples of what you mean when you say, even though Biden's not been able to make big economic policy changes, essentially it's still Trump's tax code that's in place.
Right.
But yet government has grown significantly. And how do you put that genie back in the bottle?
Yeah, massively. Tom, these are all great points. And I mean, we could probably talk around them for days on end. But this is one of the things, we all, I think, believe this, probably everybody on the call, that the shutdown was the most damaging policy mistake we've ever done. It was, and when you started out, what it affected on people unequally, it also, the disease affected people unequally. We should have never closed down schools. We should have protected the elderly. We should have never shut down all businesses. And we should, and I like that idea about making loans available to people who need them. But hey, this is not a non-recourse deal. We'll help you through this. But instead we just handed it out to everybody. So I I'm not agreeing that we should have ever done any of this. But if you're going to take everybody's job, you've made this point in your writings, if you're going to take people's jobs, shut down their businesses, then that's a taking in the U.S. Constitution sense. And we sort of have to compensate you for that. So that's the only argument that I could make for what we did. But the devastation that those two decisions had on the economy is tremendous. And I'm going to bring up iPencil again. The way I think of it is market economies, like creating a pencil. How do you get the wood out of the Northwest, here? Well, the loggers have to have a bed to sleep on. They have to eat food. They have to, have clothes. They think of all the millions of people that support the logger to fell the tree to give the pencil factory the piece of wood to make the pencil from. And so the way I think of it is every day billions and billions of decisions go in to getting a tomato in the store, to getting a pencil in your portfolio, and the government. How many pieces of information can the government handle? I think like a dozen. So you compare a government agency sitting around a table may be able to handle a dozen different concepts, juggle them, when they really need to be able to handle a billion. There is no way that that's going to be fair. And then, I got this from Arthur Laffer, who is also one of my heroes over time. But think about this. This is what happens in the economy. If we decided that it's unequitable for all the only A students to get scholarships, all right? That if all the time only the A students get scholarship, that's not fair to the F students. So what we're going to do is we're going to give all the scholarships to the F students. We're going to redistribute the scholarships. Well, think about that. A students, they know all the wrong answers. F students, they're going to guess an answer right every once in a while. because they don't know the wrong answer. They don't know the right answer either. That's why they get Fs. So at the end of the day, if you're going to give scholarships to F students, the A students will get worse Fs, and they're going to still get the scholarships. I hope I made sense out of that. And this is the problem with trying to manage the economy, is that you create incentives for people to get a scholarship, let's say, and they're going to figure out, the smart ones are going to figure out how they're going to get it, because that's easier than working your butt off felling a tree in the Northwest so that somebody can make a pencil. And so the more government gets involved, the more inequitable it becomes by its very nature. And that's why these unintended consequences of all these policies are just devastating to the fabric of America, to the economy eventually. And you're absolutely right. We have created a whole generation of people who they look at this and go, well, that's the way the economy works. Look, they spent money and we grew, which is technically what Keynes said would happen. It's never worked except in this one place. And that's why, because we opened up after the pandemic and we just threw all this money at people. And so it's morphine. It makes it look like everything's fine. But man, when that morphine wears off, you're going to find out, your leg is broken to smithereens.
Yep. I love the way you started off with your World War II example. And how it's similar, but also how it's different. I think that's really interesting. Right. And we have a couple of questions that are sort of related to this, so I'm going to riff off of those. As much as I hate to admit it, I'm also old enough to remember Reagan in the 70s. And, we thought the country had reached its, we thought the country was never again going to be as great as it was in the 1970s.
Right.
And so the way I'm able to maintain some optimism is having seen how we grew our way out of the problems of the 70s. We grew our way out of inflation and stagflation. And thinking back, I remember the work that Lowell Galloway and Richard Vedder did on how the labor market expanded after World War II. Economists were terrified after World War II. You had all these young men coming back to America who'd been trained to be violent. How could we possibly find jobs for all of them? Right. But yet we did, right? The economy expanded because of the supply of labor, and we've grown our way out of problems in the past.
Yep.
And so I'm still able to maintain some optimism that we can grow our way out of this problem also. In fact, we used to require new employees at IPI to read Robert Bartley's book, The 7 Fat Years, about the Reagan economic growth and all of that. So we have several questions from people that are essentially asking whether it's really possible to grow your way out of a problem this big. Are there limits to growth? You were involved in this 4% growth project at the George Bush Institute. Is there any reason to think that with the right policies, we can't grow our way out of this?
Let me see if that's a double negative. I think I want to say no.
I think that was a double negative. So can we grow our way out of this?
Yes, we can. I just didn't know whether to say yes or no. But yes, we can grow our way out of it. And this goes back to Merrill's point. Is like we won't get back to that 3.5% unemployment if we go down the Biden policy road. I'm obviously, I'm a well-wisher. I'm also a real optimistic person. I feel like America is not center-left. I think we're center-right, and I think that's one of the reasons the progressives are kind of hitting the mud pit now. All those wishes that they had seem to be dying a little bit at a time. I don't know. I still talk to a lot of people in D.C. and I find you're not this way, but I find a lot of people that I talk to in D.C. they're just cynical. They're going to pass it with reconciliation. It won't be as bad as we thought. I'm like, part of me is like, I don't know. The election's not far away, November 2022. So the answer is yes, we can grow out of it. I mentioned Starlink, the cloud, 5G. We have mRNA technologies, and I know that's a huge hot button, but that new technology in the pharmaceutical world, in the biotech world, I mean, if I listen to scientists that aren't part of this COVID thing and all the vaccinate, this is huge, and it will help change a lot of healthcare. One of the things that's interesting right now is that Medicare, government has run out of room. As we said, government can deal with a dozen pieces of information. The market can deal with billions. And there are all of these small startup companies figuring out ways to lower the cost of healthcare today in all kinds of ways, in millions of different ways. And so we could, in a sense, be on a cusp of a huge growth spurt. One of the ways, Tom, let me just, I don't know how else to say this, but think of it in long-term history. In 1930, non-defense government spending was 2.5% of GDP. Today, it's 25% of GDP. In other words, government has grown by tenfold from 1930, 90 years, tenfold. And yet, if we look at America, it continues to grow. So here's a different way to say the same thing. Right now, about 20% of all personal income comes from government. That includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, food stamps, all these special payments, 20%, which means 80 people are working and 20 people are in the wagon. Back in 1930, I'm going to short circuit the math, it was 97.5 people working and 2.5 people were in the wagon. And so the more people that are in the wagon and the fewer people that are pulling the wagon, the slower we grow. And the only difference, and if I take today's government and I put it on, 1928, all right, there's no way we could have pulled a wagon with 20 people in it. We weren't productive. We weren't wealthy enough. And that's one of the downsides of getting wealthier is that people go, oh, well, we can just give more and more and more and spend more and more and more and grow government more and more. And we forget the real reason for government, and it becomes redistribution. But we were able to grow in the Obama years with about 84 people pulling and 16 people in the wagon, and we grew 2%. Now, if we took 5 of those people out of the wagon, we'd grow 4. So that's the thing. It's like, are we making the people pulling stronger with 5G and broadband and blockchain and the cloud and mRNA and all of these things? Are people getting stronger that are pulling versus how many people are in the wagon? That's always the debate as a forecaster that I have. And obviously, you take people out of the wagon, have them pull, you're going to go faster. Like, that's the way you fix it. But right now, politics kind of ignores all of that. It's really not. It's not complicated. But then they just make it complicated with global warming and COVID and inequality and racism and all of these things that are just noise around what's really going on economically. So yes, we could grow out of it. It takes getting people out of the wagon.
We have so many questions from our participants, and I need to get to as many.
All right, I'm going to go fast.
But I do want to make one final comment myself about, you've made this political point a couple of times about how Biden doesn't seem to be getting his agenda through, which of course is a blessing. But it's almost politically, it's almost comical where they thought they're acting like he's the next FDR. I mean, FDR had, I think, 66 Democrats in the Senate. You know, I mean, you can't have a I'm the new FDR agenda when the Senate is evenly split and you only have a 6-seat advantage in the House, so the politics just don't map up with their ambitions. It's not where the American people are, which is the point you were making.
Yep.
Okay.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Okay. So I've got a question here from Kelly Johnston, who says they're an old friend of yours from U.S. Senate days.
Yep.
There's a lot of chatter about eliminating stepped-up basis. As far as like tax changes designed to sort of make the wealthy pay their fair share or whatever. How harmful do you think that would be, or what do you think the effects of that would be?
Well, just so everybody on the call knows, Kelly Johnston was the Secretary of the Senate, the highest ranking civilian in the United States Senate, right there. We used to meet in his office every Thursday morning, and I swear I was sitting on a chair handmade by, like Thomas Jefferson or something like that. It was in the heart of the building. It was really cool. So hi, Kelly. Here's our best guess about stepped up basis. This goes even before what I've been talking about, the progressive agenda dying, is that Chuck Schumer, he may end up voting for it, but in the end, he'll allow enough people to vote against it that it won't go through. If you think about his constituents in New York City, lawyers, accountants, like high-powered lawyers and accountants, stepped up basis is a nightmare. Like, how would you like to own a farm and then have to go back and calculate all your depreciated tractors and silos? Or if you're on Wall Street, you've got a company that was started by a grandfather, and it's not just like I bought a stock in 1932 and held it till today. These are complicated businesses and a stepped up basis just makes all of this accounting extremely complicated. Now, I get it. That's a job for some people, but it will. I think in the end, that's what we've decided. It's just too complicated to make part of this package. Hope I'm right.
We have a question from Mark Zashin, wanting to know if won't the return of inflation function as kryptonite to modern monetary theory?
Yeah.
So how do you execute modern monetary theory if interest rates go up significantly?
You can't. Like, that's what we're going to find out, is that you print 30% more money. Here's the deal. Like, the modern monetary theorists, one of their arguments is if we print 30% more money, the economy will magically grow by 30% on the real side. So in other words, Elon Musk will, if we have 10 apples and $10, and then we now have $13, that magically Elon Musk will create 13 apples. And therefore, everything still costs $1. But this idea, especially when you have all the spending, taxes, there's no way we're going to be able to increase real output by 30%, which is what the money supply is up. And so inflation has to come. But for those that believe in modern monetary theory, I just have a simple, let's try an experiment. Instead of letting the Fed print all the money, let's give every family a printing press. Let them print their own money. And then everybody can print their own way to wealth. And then once you start thinking about that, you go, yeah, this is impossible. Just because the Fed's doing it doesn't mean it's right. Counterfeiting is illegal, all right? When the Fed counterfeits, the only thing that's real, it's illegal, but it doesn't work. You can't get something for nothing.
We have an observation from David Cam. So you've mentioned chips and semiconductors several times. He says, I work in the semiconductor industry. Our production has continued 24/7 and we have never shut down. So he's making the point here that it's been overall demand that has increased rather than production slowing down. How does that relate to what you've been saying to us here today?
I think David, I think was his name. I think David, more power to you, way to go, and keep producing. I don't think everybody in the world did. I think there were supply chain issues, but he's on to something. And this is, when you print 30% more money. So let's just say we just found a new oil field and tapped into it it doesn't matter where, Saudi Arabia, North Dakota, it doesn't matter. And we bring all this new oil online, and it would have brought prices down in a perfectly normal, no new money world, no inflation world. Oil prices would have fallen by 10%. But then let's imagine in that world, we now increase the money supply by 5%. Well, what would happen is instead of oil going down by 10%, it would only go down by 5%. So people would argue, oh, see, oil prices are down 5%. And I would go, yeah, but that's still, we still have 5% more money, but they should have been down 10. I hope that makes sense. In other words, there are price pressures that come from individual supply and demand issues, whether it's lumber, oil, semiconductors, and then there are price pressures that come from money, and you have to separate the two. Money printing is inflation. That's what Mises said, Hayek said, Friedman said, Fisher said, Vexel said, all of them, Bomvarek, they all taught us that inflation is printing money, clipping coins in Rome. that's what creates inflation. And so that's where we are today. All the other supply up and down, and this is a great point about semiconductors. Yeah, some supply didn't come down, some went up, but net prices are rising because we do have demand, if you will, coming from all this money printing.
The standard, I've got a couple questions on inflation here. The standard inflation theory is exactly as you just laid out right now, which is why a lot of us have been wondering why it hasn't arrived before now, right?
Right.
There are some reputable economists who describe themselves as free market and sort of being in the center right, who are actually saying things like what we really ought to be worried about is deflation,
right,
rather than inflation. Is there anything to that? I mean, why do they come up with that idea?
Yeah, and there are a lot of reputable, smart people out there that have looked at this. Here's what I believe. If you go, one of the reasons that they're saying that is that the Federal Reserve did all that quantitative easing, QE 1, 2, and 3, if you remember that, after 2008, 9, and so they boosted the monetary base by a massive amount. But then because they regulated banks, they increased capital requirements. I mean, we had in some of these big banks, like that have offices in downtown New York City, there is an entire floor of the building. These are big buildings that is filled with regulators. And basically the bank pays for their offices and they just move in. All right. And we've regulated these banks so much that even though the Federal Reserve was printing more money and adding it to the system, buying treasury bonds, they limited the ability of the banks to multiply it. So if you look at the M2 measure of money, it grew 6% a year all during that period, even though the monetary base was up 20%. Well, this time is different because now the Fed printed trillions of dollars of new monetary base, but then we paid banks to lend it out. So back in 08, 09, we were scared of banks lending. We didn't want more subprime loans, more leverage. Well, now we use banks to do PPP loans. Plus, when we gave out unemployment checks, stimulus checks, we direct deposited them into the bank. So in fact, banks have so much money on their balance sheet right now. They don't want new deposits. They don't want them because they need more capital to hold deposits, and that's why they're doing reverse repos today and all these things trying to sop up this extra liquidity, and it's why we have inflation. And then just for the record, last December, the Federal Reserve said that inflation this year, so this is December, 6 months ago, they said inflation this year was going to be 1.8%. They've now raised that to 2.4, then 3.4, and guess where it is? 5.4. So, and one last thing, Tom, I was the chief economist of the Joint Economic Committee. When I was there, I took advantage of one of the things that I could do, and that is I was able to go back and buy old books that were in the government printing office. I have the entire collection of economic reports of the president, all right? And that was started in 1946, and it goes till today. So I have all the books, and I read them, all right? And one thing that was true about the 1970s and late 60s is that the official government entities, the Fed, the Joint Economic Committee, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Treasury Department, all had input into these books. They all said inflation is transitory. It's coming from OPEC. It's coming from a weak currency. It's coming from a drought in the Midwest. It's coming from a shortage of, it went on and on and on and on for a dozen years. And they were wrong every year. And that's where we are today. This idea that this is transitory, and the whole point is they go, well, back in 09, we didn't have inflation. Like, yeah, that's because we hammered banks with regulation. This time, we're forcing banks to increase the money supply. That's why I think this is different.
So you're saying you're confident that Milton Friedman is going to be vindicated?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. One of the truest joys of my life was meeting Milton and Rose for real in person a number of times. It was like I'll never forget that.
I've got a couple questions about this. One of the things that seems to be really out of whack right now is sort of the relationship between housing prices and mortgage rates and things like that. I mean, in most parts of the country right now, if you're a homeowner, the value of your property is going up at like an unprecedented rate.
Yes.
If we believe what we're being told, yet we have interest rates that are below the rate of inflation. And of course, you can, if you pay enough mortgage interest, you can still deduct it from your taxes.
Right.
So this seems like a really severe imbalance that is frankly dramatically advantaging homeowners and dramatically disadvantaging people who want to get into the home ownership market and aren't there yet.
Yep.
Is this going to become just a huge societal problem?
You know what, Tom? You've mentioned a couple of times this inequality and COVID and the policies. The Fed claims they want to deal. So they have a dual mandate: inflation and unemployment. Well, they've been trying to add kind of two more mandates. One is inequality, and one is global warming. I don't know how printing money affects global warming, but nonetheless, inequality. I sort of get how they think that might, they might be able to help that. But I sort of get it, all right? I would have a completely different way of using monetary policy. I would not print more money, keep inflation low. That's the way to help most people. But they are actually creating inequality. By pumping all this money in, they're lifting the value of assets, homes, stocks, all of these things, and the winners win, all right? And those that don't have those assets are falling further behind. So the Fed is actually creating more inequality, no doubt about it. This is one of the saddest things. We all learned it in at least in our free market way of learning economics. It's called unintended consequences, and the Fed doesn't seem to have a clue what they are. But that's sort of government, and it's been true for decades, centuries, probably millennium, but in my knowledge, centuries. So
yeah. I have another question from Mark Zashin here, which I think is relevant to some of the conversations we've had. Is Joe Biden going to end up as the next Jimmy Carter? Now, that's a political question, not an economic question, but
right.
He certainly seems at this point to have already dramatically overreached. Yep.
My view is that the answer to that is probably yes. The only thing I wonder about is, at least back in the 70s, I get it that the press was already starting to tilt more toward the left, but most press was pretty, at least near the center. The worrisome thing I have, it's going to take the history books to show that Joe Biden was Jimmy Carter. It won't be, we won't, I probably won't even be alive by the time historians figure that out. But that is exactly, in my opinion, what's happening. It's one of the reasons why Tom, you said, look, the 6 seats in the House, I think is the right number, 50-50 in the Senate. This is not FDR. And he's trying to do too much. And that's why this progressive agenda is sort of dying on the vine. I want it to be dead completely. I'm not convinced. I'm not going to stop fighting. I want growth. The way you get growth is don't raise taxes, stop this crazy spending. And one thing about executive orders, by the way, just so everybody thinks about it, it's like a golf shot. Every shot, no matter by who, makes someone happy. All right. And the thing about executive orders, if it takes this guy to put it in or that gal, it'll take that guy or that gal to take it away. So, yep. It's a temporary thing. It's not what I worry about is the permanent ones, yeah. Which are like putting in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's a great transition for me to get to sort of one last question. We have more than that, but we promised people we would let them go at 1:15. So we have a question from Howard Stevenson. How important is it that the dollar is still sort of the reserve currency of the world? And are we putting that in danger with all of this growth in the money supply and inflation? I mean, it's generally accepted that there are advantages that accrue to the U.S. just by the fact that so many transactions are dollar denominated.
Right. Yep, I totally agree. We benefit a great deal by having that the world's reserve currency. The way I say it, you know, if we keep going with these policies, it'll be the same problems that the Brits had with the pound, and so you got to go back to the 60s and 70s, and you just watch them just lose it. All right, 50s, 60s, 70s, because they blew their policies for decades, and it wasn't until, you know, Margaret Thatcher came in and fixed it. But the bottom line is that eventually, yeah, but I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. I think the dollar, but in my lifetime, the dollar will remain the world's reserve currency. One thing I think, to put this in perspective, is that, yeah, we're doing modern monetary theory, but so is everybody else.
Yeah.
Japan's doing it, Europe's doing it, the UK's doing it. I mean, China, because they use a fixed exchange rate, they're doing it too. Because otherwise their currency would have soared if they hadn't increased their money supply relative to the dollar. They don't want that to happen. So because they peg, they kind of take our monetary policy too. So everybody's doing it. So we're all, and this is why there's so many people that believe in Bitcoin. Oh, we need a alternative private money, which I always argue to people, just remember, if you can't pay your taxes in it, and the Treasury will never let you pay your taxes in it, it'll never be a currency. So that's my short Bitcoin comment.
Well, we actually did have a couple Bitcoin questions, so I'm glad you touched that. It seems like it's a speculative play right now, but maybe nothing more than that.
Yeah, let me add one quick thing. I mean, there's a lot of people out there that want to stick it to the man and, you know, put the thumb in the eye of the, you know, I'm going to make them take Bitcoin. But I use that example. You tell the IRS, I'm only going to pay my taxes in Bitcoin. It's like the guy who pays his taxes in pennies, you know,
right.
I'm only going to pay you in Bitcoin. And the IRS says, well, you have two choices. You either pay us in dollars, or you go to that jail cell, you know, and so it's like, in the end, you know, you can say, this is my currency, but when it comes to interacting with the government, they can say no. And then I just don't see how it survives that.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Brian, we're going to have to wrap it up right there. I want to thank you so much for this. This has been terrific. I've personally thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm sure that our audience has as well. Thank you, Dr. Matthews, for helping guide our Q&A and questions. And I want to remind folks that this event will be archived video on our website and also on our YouTube channel. So if you know people who you think would have enjoyed participating in this, you'll be able to direct them to that. And so that will be there for you, you know, for the foreseeable future. And I also want to again thank our supporters on the call. Thank you so much for your support, and remind folks again that they can talk to Addie Crimmins if they'd like to know more about IPI or get more involved with IPI. We would love to have you on board as a supporter and a friend in some way. So with that, we'll wrap things up. Brian, thank you so much. That was terrific. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tom.
I'd be happy to talk all afternoon, except Dr. Matthews and I have a podcast to record in a few minutes. So we will let you go. So thank you to everyone for joining us. We appreciate it. We hope you have a good rest of your day, and join us again next time.